Now, talking about electrocution, let's have a look at electricity. Electricity can interact with us in several ways. It can cause electrical shock, can cause burns, can cause death, and can cause fire. A couple of precautions to take with electricity. Always turn power off before inserting and withdrawing plugs, because if you've got damp hands, perhaps with perspiration, you can have an electric shock if the socket is on whilst you're inserting and withdrawing plugs. Do not work on equipment if switches, plugs or sockets get hot. Do not overload sockets. One single domestic electrical socket, or even a commercial electrical socket, is only supposed to deliver 13 amps. Now, if you put more than one appliance into the socket, by means of a trailing cable, for example, with an extension, several extensions, if more than one appliance is running at 13 amps and they've been used at the same time, you will get overheating at the socket, and it can cause fire. Now, proper wiring of plugs. From a commercial point of view, you don't have to bother about wiring the plugs. That will be undertaken by a qualified electrician. But you really need to know about how to wire plugs from a domestic point of view, especially with older appliances, because as you know, with newer appliances, they come with moulded plugs on these days. Always regularly check equipment. Again, any problems, if something is not as it should be, then report it. Always check cables and flex for signs of wear and tear and cracks, and again report it to your supervisor or line manager as necessary. Do not touch switches and appliances with wet hands. Always use qualified electricians. Now, portable electrical equipment testing or PAT testing. Anything within a commercial establishment that has a plug on it has to be tested every year. And the electrician will come round, check the equipment to make sure it's in good working order, and they will put a little sticker on the machine. And that machine then will be tested every year. Fuses. Fuses really are strips of wire. Sometimes they're enclosed in ceramic tubes, but they are meant to prevent overheating and fires. An RCD is a residual current device. It's a portable circuit breaker. If you were working outside, perhaps cutting the grass or cutting the hedge, and you inadvertently cut the electrical wire with the device, then the RCD, if the appliance is plugged into the RCD and the RCD is plugged into a main socket, it will detect that minutest change of current, and it turns the appliance off within 1,000th of a second. So you'll have a less chance of a fatal shock, because the more or the longer you're in contact with electricity, main supply, the higher the chance of having a fatal shock. Now, RCDs are supplied to people in the commercial sector, especially in the care sector, where care workers are working in private people's homes, where the customer actually owns the home, and we can't really insist on PAT testing. So they are supplied with an RCD to help protect them whilst they're working with the customer's electrical appliances. A circuit breaker is the modern equivalent of a fuse. It's a bank of switches, which when everything's working okay, all the switches will be on. But if there's an appliance that might be faulty, it can cause the circuit breaker to go to the off position. And you just go along and put the circuit breaker switch back to on. But you must ask the question, if a circuit breaker goes to off, or if a fuse blows, there's a reason for it. 9 times out of 10 it's because the appliance that was being used at the time is faulty, and it must be checked and remedied. And there's several things you need to do in case of an electric shock. Now, if you see somebody who's having an electric shock, perhaps they're shaking uncontrollably, you can see them in contact with a surface that might have electric current going through it. The first thing you should do is always call for help. It's far better having more than one person there to actually attend to the casualty. Now, the next thing you should try to do is turn off the power. Now, it might not always be obvious where the power supply is, where the switch is. In that case, you need next to remove the casualty from the power as quickly as possible. but without touching them with your bare hands. Because if you touch them with your bare hands, you will have an electric shock and you can become electrocuted as well. So try to wrap something around your hands, such as clothing, or if you can find a rubber broom handle, then knock the person away from the power supply. Because the longer they're in touch with the power supply, the higher the chance they will have a fatal shock. And then you need to follow your training after the casualty has been removed from the power. For example, if you receive first aid training and the casualty's heart has stopped beating, then you might have to attempt CPR. Or perhaps their heart is beating but they've collapsed, so you might have to put them into a recovery position. But obviously only follow those procedures if you've received training. Okay, let's have a look at fire prevention. Now, in order for a fire to burn, there must be 3 elements, and those 3 elements must be present, almost like the 3 corners of a triangle. What do you think those elements are? Pause the presentation for a second, have a think, and write down what do you think are the 3 elements that you need for a fire to burn. Well, they are, first of all, oxygen or air, an ignition or heat source, fuel to actually burn. Without one or more of those elements, the fire will not burn. Now, fire prevention. Dangers from fires include burns, smoke, suffocation, loss of consciousness, death, toxic fumes, and property collapse. Please do not underestimate the power of smoke. That's all you need to take is one big inhalation of smoke in a smoke-filled room and you will pass out straight away. You won't start coughing and spluttering, you won't have time, because the smoke replaces the oxygen that your brain needs on a regular basis. So as soon as you take a big deep breath of smoke, you will pass out. And if you are not brought around within about 3 minutes, you will die. There is a rule of 3s. You can live for 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, and 3 minutes without air. Now, so smoke inhalation is the biggest killer in fires, especially domestic fires. The biggest killer amongst the emergency services is property collapse. Because the emergency services, the firefighters, they'll wear breathing apparatus, so smoke won't affect them, but they will tend to go into a building after the flames have taken hold, and perhaps the internal structure, the beams, etc., will start to weaken and cause the main part of the building to actually collapse. Now, some smoke is a bit more deadly than what I call ordinary smoke. Perhaps smoke from paper and wood will make you pass out instantaneously and kill you within 3 minutes. But certain materials, when they burn, they give off toxic fumes, which will kill you a lot sooner. So fire prevention. Identify and control fire hazards. Look at that first phrase, identify and control fire hazards. What are we carrying out there? Yeah, it's a risk assessment, but this time it's a fire risk assessment. We're identifying not just the hazards, but the fire hazards. Good housekeeping, keeping things clean and tidy and cluttered away from buildings, keeping fire hazards away from buildings, build-up of material, keeping waste paper bins empty. Maintain fire prevention measures. There must be evacuation procedures and training. Now, we can control fires by firefighting, which our fire service does, by using automatic controls which are built into buildings, such as sprinkler systems, and extinguishers. Extinguishers, you will need to know, for the sake of the exam, what type of extinguisher we need for what type of fire. And the control principles of fire prevention are starvation, starving the fire from oxygen, smothering, which is a lot like starvation actually, it's preventing any oxygen or air getting into the fire, and cooling, which is what our firefighters use. They aim water in the main at the hottest part of the flame, and the fire subsides. Now, these are the different types of fire extinguisher. Until Europe, again as they want, poked their nose into British business several years ago, all extinguishers used to be a different colour. But with European intervention, all extinguishers are now red. But in order to compensate for that, you will find a coloured ribbon around the top of the extinguisher, or somewhere on the extinguisher, saying what the contents of the extinguisher are and what type of fire to fight. Now let's have a look at the first one. The first one has a red ribbon on a red extinguisher, so in effect the extinguisher is all red. And this is used for wood, paper and textiles. Now the next one, foam, that's got a cream coloured ribbon on the top, and the foam one is used for wood, paper, textiles and flammable liquids. The next one is CO2. It's got a black ribbon, that's carbon dioxide. It's a very heavy gas. It acts like an invisible blanket. It sinks down or holds down over the flames to stop any oxygen from getting into the fire. And that's used for flammable liquids, flammable gases and electrical fires. Takes us on to the blue one, or the blue ribbon one, that's powder. And this is based on salt, or finely ground salt. So it does make a mess when that's used. Now this is used for everything. It's used for wood, paper, textiles, flammable liquids, flammable gases, electrical fires and vehicle fires. Now the last one, you don't usually see this as a portable extinguisher. It's usually something that's built into a system, usually a computer system, where if there is a fire we don't want to damage the delicate computer equipment by using, say, a powder extinguisher, where the salt itself would corrode and damage all electrical equipment. So it's a green ribbon, and this is a vaporizer liquid or solvent, and it's used for exactly the same fires as the blue powder, but this time it evaporates on contact with the fire, the solvent, and doesn't leave any residue. So it is good for delicate electrical equipment.